Oh, welcome to today's session. I'm going to share screen here quick and we will roll with the presentation then today. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a different year here in my part of South Dakota than it was last year. So um, it's just one of those things, I guess, that, feast or famine on the rain situation. It's kind of in everybody's mind at this point. So with that, let's talk about your current estate plan and things that are going on with farm and ranch estates, because it's kind of a big topic for most farmers and ranchers, whether they've actually done anything at this point or not. And as you're working through your own estate plans, or if you're talking to family about what's in place, hopefully some of this information will help you as you move forward with putting your plan together and some of those ideas and talking points to think about. So if you need to get a hold of me, there's my contact information. I'm based in the Sioux Falls Regional Center down whoa, this one is the wrong slide that I put in today. So we're actually down on West 38 now. So down by the Empire Mall, down in that area instead of over by East 8th. So looks like I've got some things to fix here. So before we really get into the plan, I wanted to talk a little bit about some things going on in the planning process and maybe some things that we should talk about and consider before we actually get into the plan. So if we just rank them as a top 5 and go through them in backwards order, one of the things that we're having issues with is farmers and ranchers don't separate retirement from succession planning. And uh, this study that I'm putting up here for you is getting to be a little dated. It's 2019 at this point, and it is for Iowa farmers. So don't take that and throw it away just because it says Iowa. Um, but I think pretty much it's going to look a lot the same for South Dakota farmers and ranchers when they're thinking about, am I going to retire? Will I kind of retire? And will I never retire? And part of that conversation that we need to have when we're thinking about bringing a kid back to the operation is, what does your lack of retirement or semi-retirement mean for that kid coming back to the operation, the finances of the operation, and how everybody works together. So that is one of those things that we really need to be thinking about and talking about when we're thinking about putting the succession plan and our estate plan together. So if we talk about why farmers are retiring, or they're retiring at a later age, or maybe just semi-retiring, yeah, maybe I'll slow down a little bit. If you look down that list there, the respondents of the survey said, 75% of them have a hard time giving up control of the farm. And I'm not going to point any fingers, but there's a lot of phone calls that come into my office and conversations across the table. That's really is a big one. You put your blood, sweat, and tears into the thing. It's hard to give up that control and move to that next generation because, you've already tried this thing or that thing, or idea 1 or 2, and it worked or it didn't work. So giving up that control of even an enterprise for some people is pretty tricky. The second bullet there at 69% says, modern equipment allows them to farm a whole lot longer. I can think back into my high school days, or junior high type of days, when you were thinking about going out to take care of a cornfield in the middle of the summer. You weren't an air conditioned tractor. A lot of those guys were, you're running an open cab and you're running a field cultivator through the field 2-3 times a year. Well, the modern equipment and the modern technology that we have allows us to do anything from an air-conditioned tractor cab. We aren't running that cultivator over our fields multiple times per year. So some of that, that ease of the improvement that we have in our equipment really allows us to stick around on the farm longer. An interesting statement in that third one that says 66% relate retirement to their own mortality. Uh, I could probably fill notebooks full of individuals that have said, as soon as I retire, I'll probably die. Or when so and so retired, they only lived 3 more years. So retirement is really tied into that mortality thought that if I slow down and I quit, then it's over. And, I want to be around for my grandchildren, or I want to be around to do more of insert your hobby here if you have one. So, relating that retirement to mortality is really a big component for a lot of farmers and ranchers out there. And then, we're living longer. If you look at some of the life insurance agents that I work with, show me some of their mortality tables. And used to be mortality tables went up to like 100, and that was the really old people that made it to be 100. Mortality tables for some of our life insurance policies, and if you're looking at buying an insurance policy, are up into the 110 years at this point. So we've been able to monitor heart issues. We're able to monitor cholesterol. We're looking at blood sugar and diabetes, and we're being proactive on those things. So, and that's a good thing that we're healthier and things are working better that way, but we are living longer. So we put retirement off, into the future someday. About 55% indicated that they don't have a successor, so why would I retire? I'm just gonna keep farming because nobody else wants the ground or wants to come back and farm, which is, something that is a true reality for a lot of individuals. The kids moved away and have their own jobs doing something, and they're very successful in that manner. So making sure that we're thinking about who the successor for our operations are, or what that estate plan that we're putting together looks like, it's still pretty critical, because just because you don't have somebody coming back to the farm doesn't mean that we should put off retirement planning or estate planning for the future of our kids' future, and putting that plan together. And then somehow I feel like that bottom bullet, even though it comes in at 54%, I think that one needs or could be much higher depending on the farming group that you're in. And they're like, I just don't know what else I'd do. I don't have any other hobbies other than the farming that I do. I've got cattle, so I do chores and I do this, and every month we know what we're going to do because of the seasonality of our jobs and the things that we have going on. But that I don't know what else I do component is really an important thing to be thinking about. So if you relate to any of those issues on while you're putting off retirement or not retiring, let's think about how those really affect the long-term aspects and the long-term goals of your farming operation. Because some of the problems with not planning for that retirement or that post-active farming life, whether you consider it retiring or not, uh, are some of these big bullet points here. If we don't have that plan in place, we don't have those funds available for living expenses in the future. We don't have funds available for long-term care needs. And as you think about what the cost of a nursing home or assisted living might be, that really starts to become an issue, because those expenses, if you go into a facility, are now going to come out of whatever you have available in and cash resources and other financial things that maybe you've put away. So if your family history, for example, has dementia or Alzheimer's or some of those memory issues, and the odds of you needing long-term care, and maybe needing long-term care for quite a few years, that's really going to take a lot of resources away from the farm operation. Bullet number 3 says no plan for your farm or ranch assets or personal assets. If we don't have a plan for those and what we really want to do, and that really ties in with that bottom bullet there, how are we going to bring the kid back to the operation? will they have the assets that they need? If we don't have kids coming back to our farm, how does giving them, you know, a quarter of ground that they now own with all of their brothers and sisters, how does that affect their balance sheets and their financial situation as you look at that long-term planning for them, not just your own plan? So there's a lot of things that roll together there when we think about, the lack of a retirement plan and, where we're going to live, how we're going to pay for that, and who's going to take care of us when we maybe aren't able to take care of ourselves as good as we should be doing. Number 4 is is something that you probably hear a lot, that is unintentional consequences, mainly because we're using incorrect assumptions when we're putting our plans together. And, some of those plans and those assumptions might be right, but in other cases, we really need to expand our thought process and talk about all the things with everybody that's involved in our farm businesses. One assumption that farmers tell me a bunch is, this is our business and we're not sharing it with anyone. And that includes the kids that are farming with them. That one really comes into play and starts to hit hard for a lot of those multi-generational operations because we need to not only share it with the kid that's farming with us, but also those grandchildren that are coming into the operation. If your financial situation is not good enough or not stable enough that you don't want anyone else to know that it's not very stable, bringing somebody else into the farm is a little bit scary from my perspective because we don't have the financial stability to pay for and take care of everyone's living expenses, basically. We don't have that opportunity to grow. We don't have the ability to take care of an accident or a situation that might come into play that way. So we got to be thinking about if we're not sharing our financial situation or our business plan with other people, how come? Okay. The 2 in blue relate to the kids that are involved in your family, and, I've had people tell me, "My kids get along great. They won't have any fights or arguments about what's supposed to happen here. They know what's supposed to happen. They know that I want the ground to go to the farming kid so that he can keep farming." But that all kind of tweaks once you're gone and you're not there as the patriarch or the matriarch of this family and the glue that's kind of holding those kids together a little bit. And especially when you start thinking about the asset value of that farm that you're transitioning, we can blame it on the outlaws, those people that your amazing children married. Maybe they're looking at it going, "Hey, our share of a $20 million farming operation, that looks like something we could really take and turn into college funds for our kids, retirement funds for us." And so we gotta kinda be thinking about those longer term effects. So keeping keeping that family relationship in mind, and if we want our family to get along early or after you're gone, we need to start having some of those conversations early. So sometimes the assumptions are great. However, I've seen quite a few times that we make the wrong assumptions. Number 3 comes back to a coworker of mine who's recently retired down in Nebraska, and he kinda calls it advanced thumb twiddling, as you see in that cartoon that's over there. But he calls it the circle of inaction. A whole bunch of you guys registered for this session today, and I'm mostly assuming because you feel like you should have a plan. You're kinda at that step number 1 right there that say, "Yep, I really, really need to have a plan." And we're fired up about it, we're excited, we're energetic, so we get into number 2, where you go to a meeting or you meet with a lawyer, you come to Heather's, excuse me, can't speak, sustaining the legacy component meetings, and you get all the information, and then you hit number 3 and you're like, "Wow, this is complicated. There's too much stuff. There's so much information. I just don't know where to go." And we run into step number 4 where no action is taken. And we kind of sit there with our current plan that we have in place that we're going to talk about in a minute, but we don't do anything proactive to make any changes or improvements to what our estate plan or our succession plan could look like. So hopefully we get you past this circle of inaction through some of the programs that I put on, some of the information that you're learning today, and some of those types of things. So in an ideal world, planning would be it'd go in order. I'm not even going to try to say words that aren't coming to me today. But step one would be we take an inventory of all of our assets, the human capital involved in our operation. Step two, we start having those conversations with family members about what we want to have happen. What are our goals? How are we going to get there? Step three brings us to the point where we look into some of those ideas and say, hey, where do we need to go? What do we like to have happen? Which ones do we discard because, that's not really for the benefit of the whole operation? Step four, we go find those professionals that help us. And when I start talking about professionals, I'm beyond just an attorney. We're looking at financial advisors, somebody to help us with our retirement plans. Maybe we can set something up for our farm businesses so that we've got a retirement plan in place. We're talking about maybe insurance agents, anywhere from long-term care insurance, health insurance, life insurance, if we're looking at different ways to pass on assets or pass on the value of assets. Whole bunch of professionals that could be on your team depending on what your plan's going to look like. And then those professionals help you create that plan and put a plan in place so that, you've got all the legal documents, you've got titles changed and all those components. And then the step there at the bottom says that we review that plan. If you're on this meeting and you have created an estate plan and you haven't looked at it in the last 3 to 5 years, I'd sure encourage you to go back and make sure that everything has remained the same so that you don't need to make some tweaks or changes to that. Changes I want you to be thinking about are changes in anything that's gone on in your life. Has there been weddings? Has there been divorces? Are there people that have died that are involved in your operation? Maybe you've had a wedding and you have a new in-law, and not only a new in-law, but you also have new grandchildren and you want to do something for them. Or you've decided that you want to be more philanthropic. See, again, with the big words that aren't coming off my tongue today. But maybe you want to do more gifting to nonprofit organizations. Reviewing those plans and updating them helps keep you up to date on those types of things. Also, if there's any changes in the law with tax situations, then we need to be looking at our plans and reviewing them as well. So, and if you change your mind on how you want things to go, you can do that too and update your plan through a review at that time as well. So number two, as we get down through the things that are some of the big problem causers in putting this plan together, is knowing what the vision of the farm is and how we want assets to be divided. So the consideration of fair versus equal distribution is one of those big questions for a lot of farmers, and sometimes gets a little dicey between husbands and wives on operations as well, because we love all of our children equally. So that's how I want everything to go. I want equal value or equal farm ground, equal dollars to go to each of our children. That gets to be a little bit tricky trying to put those fair values on everything. Because if you're trying to give one of your farming children the farm so that they can stay farming, where are you going to come up with an equal value to give it to all the non-farming children? I've also had people tell me, I'd like to just give them all 40 acres and put their name on 40 acres, but this pasture, or this 40 acres is pasture, this 40 acres raises 250 bushel corn, and the value of that ground isn't equal. So do I have to give the kid that just gets pasture, do I have to give him cash too to make it equal? So making some of those decisions is really a tricky component for a lot of people. And another one of those spots where they get stuck and say, you know what, there's just too many options, too much to do, too much to think about. So we just tell our kid that's on the farm, someday this is all going to be yours. And then we don't put a plan together that accomplishes that. So I really encourage you to think about in your mind what's fair, what's equal, um, and how you want your assets to be distributed that direction. And if we kind of make some of those decisions with the end in mind, you can come up with some strategies to help you with that. So sometimes thinking about what your goals are help you answer those other distribution questions as you go forward. So if you know that you want your farm to go to your farming kid, probably the other children aren't going to get an equal dollar inheritance, but you're going to come up with other ways to say or show them that, hey, I still love you even though you didn't get the farm, basically. And the number one problem or the number one situation that we see going on with farmers and ranch operations is that really communication on these tougher topics doesn't happen. And that whole lack of communication circles around into the problems that occur. Whether it's a 30-year-old kid that wants to try something or make new changes, and he just doesn't bring them up to dad at all because he knows dad's going to shut him down, or dad doesn't talk to the kids that are on the farm because I want to gift some of my farm to the church or to a school or to this other nonprofit that I really believe in heartedly, but I know the kid's not going to like it. So we don't talk about it. We're just going to spring it on them at death because we put it into our will and those types of things. And that just all wraps into more problems. So having some of those conversations, and maybe the first conversation you need to have within your family is, when you're gone, will you still have a family? Will they still get together for Christmas after you're gone? Will they still do whatever the big topic or the big trip or the big outing is that your family does and enjoys now? Will they still do that when you're gone? Or is there going to be an issue because of the plan that you put in place? And sometimes we got to be thinking about, if everybody's on the same page and everybody's shooting towards that same target, we got to make sure mom and dad are on the same page, grandma and grandpa are on the same page, and make sure that we're working those things out first before we really get started. So, as I mentioned, you've already got an estate plan in place, and that's the topic title that I used to to get you to register for this presentation. So let's talk about that a little bit. And we're going to talk about the things that you have in place right now that really make up your estate plan. Whether you've been to see an attorney or not, you have these things going on in your family and in your life right now. You have items that are contracts, you own property and other assets in certain ways, and then there's that final at death component of probate that comes into play and distributes everything else that maybe isn't taken care of. So let's walk through that a little bit and see kind of where you're at. So the first thing that you have, and the order of distribution is really, or is the contract. That's the first way assets are distributed. So if you have anything that's been written down or signed as a contract with beneficiaries that have been listed, that contract takes first place over everything. So examples of those might be life insurance policies, retirement accounts, maybe investment accounts that you have, and sometimes checking accounts that are might have a beneficiary tied to them. So, for example, your life insurance policy has beneficiaries listed. So, if you bought that policy 40 years ago and you had two children at the time and you listed two children as your life insurance beneficiaries, when you pass away, that money goes to those two children that you have listed. Even if you've had a total of 5 children, 3 of them are not going to get money from that life insurance policy because they were not listed on that contract. So you really want to go through and find all of those policies that you have out there, different retirement accounts. If you've had jobs where there was a cost share retirement account and some of those types of things, who's the beneficiary on them, and make some updates and changes to that, because that's pretty relatively simple and cheap paperwork for you to do. So you can really look into those beneficiaries that are listed on any of those contracts that you might have around. Really affects your estate, because if you put a life insurance policy together with the intention that the policy is supposed to go to the farming child so that they can then buy out their brothers and sisters, if you're gifting land and those types of things, that's really an important component. If you're using it in that manner. Another reason that it's pretty important is if you have non-farming kids that you want to give those that beneficiary, or make them beneficiaries of that life insurance policy so that they're getting cash instead of land. That's a big deal if you've got the land inheriting kid listed on the policy as well. The reason that sometimes comes into play is because we put beneficiaries on our insurance policies, and then on our will, sometimes we might say, hey, I want the money from my insurance policy to go to these people and be distributed in this manner. Well, by the time they read the will, your life insurance policy has already been looked at and taken into account and been distributed, because that's based on a contract. So you're already beyond that point when they actually open up your will and read that. So I really want you to be thinking about that and look at any changes that might be needed in that insurance policy. So once you get past those contracts, then you can really look into the ownership of different assets. Those that have titles on them are really going to need to be considered, because how you title different property, whether it's anything from that fancy Mustang to the 1943 silage truck that you only use once a year, that you conveniently forget to, put new tags on every year, it still has a title. So make sure that you're looking at how those items are titled, because that just is the first step on how that's distributed. And it goes down into land and those types of things as well. There has been some conversations on, well, I'll just change the title of that piece of ground, the West 40. I want my kid to have that. So I'm just going to put them on the title with me. And while that seems like a relatively easy way to transfer the farm, it's also one of those things that kind of gets you in trouble sometimes if, say that kid that you put on the title is in a car accident and they're now being sued for millions of dollars. But they don't have millions of dollars of insurance or millions of dollars of cash on hand. The attorneys in that case are going to go back through all of that individual's assets, and when they see that they're on there as an owner of that piece of property that you put them on, now they have the ability to go after that money, because there's an asset there that will cover the expense of the lawsuit, and make that payment for them. So maybe not really the best way if we're just putting me and my kid on a piece of property to make that transition. So back in 2016, I did a evaluation or a survey of farmers and ranchers um, about talking about how we're going to buy the ground from the next generation and how we're going to get that money to the next generation. I asked both the landowner generation, the on-farm heirs, and the off-farm heirs to answer these statements, whether they agree or disagree with the statement. So the statement here says the next generation cannot afford to purchase the land from me. And if you look at the level of agreement from the landowners, the on-farm generation, and then the off-farm heirs, we can see that making some type of plan so that the on-farm generation doesn't have to buy those acres out is really an important factor. So when those assets are titled and how they're transferred is going to be an important component of your estate plan. Another question that I asked, or a statement that I asked everybody to agree or disagree with, was I need to retain the ownership of these assets to provide an income source for my living expenses. And this was related to the landowner generation. Does the landowner generation need to keep those assets so that they have money to pay living expenses? And you can see the variation in responses there on who agreed and who didn't necessarily agree as much with this statement, because we think there's other things going on out there in the world, whether there's retirement accounts or whatever might be available for mom and dad to live off of. So if we look at that and think about titling that property, and we're just going to title the property into our kids' names, well, they've got, if you want to think about it going forward, they've got the ability to say, well, that's my ground, mom and dad. I get half the income off of it as well. So, thinking about those types of things when it relates back to the titles, maybe changing title to our kids while we're alive doesn't necessarily accomplish all of our goals. I'm not going to talk about each of the different ways that you can title property or other assets, whether it's ground or, a titled vehicle like a truck, the truck or the pickup and those types of things. I just want you to be aware that there are several different ways that things can be titled beyond putting mom and dad or using the other words of mom or dad in those titles, which all have different connotations on how we can title property. One of the big things that we hear about and we talk about in the Sustaining the Legacy conferences is the creation of a business entity, a corporation, a partnership, whether it's a triple LP or an LLC or some of those types of things, is that we can put land and other business assets into some of these entities. Usually we run the business side through the corporation or one of the partnership options, and land is more titled into some of the trusts for different reasons that we're not going to talk about today. That's a whole hour presentation all by itself. But if we think about those different entities that can hold ownership and what they might be able to do for us for our transition plan, that might be something that you want to be thinking about as well. It's also another thing that if you've set up a trust or one of those partnerships, making sure that all the ground that is supposed to be titled into those specific areas really is included where it's supposed to be. Because if it's not titled into the partnership, the new truck that you just purchased doesn't get transitioned the way that you thought it was going to, if it's just owned by you and your spouse or just you in general. So each of those different entities come with their own rules. They're written into the business. They talk about who can own what. They talk about how ownership is transferred. And they also include ways that you can get out of that entity, through some type of buy-sell agreement, or if the business is terminated, where do the assets go? So it comes with all of those plans and those thoughts as you move forward, but there are ways that those entities can work for you. If we think about how those entities as owners work in your estate, they can transition the operation. So we can do different management components, different excuse me, different ownership changes, whether we're transitioning shares, whether we're transitioning percent of ownership and value at different times in our business agreement. These entities also serve as basically an individual, so we can put leases together under that ownership name. We can do buy-sell agreements. We can look at wages and compensation. Maybe we're looking at insurance, health insurance for our family businesses and those types of things. So all of those things tie together if we have an entity that is owning the property and the assets on our piece of ground. One of the other statements that I asked that I found that was really interesting in the differences in perceptions between the on-farm heirs and the off-farm heirs was the statement that land ownership should be transferred into a new entity to accomplish my goals. And the on-farm heirs 100% of those that responded indicated that they thought the use of an entity was good. The off-farm heirs sided more towards disagreeing with those statements. So again, this goes back into some of those communication factors of letting everybody know why we're doing things so that they have an understanding of what the estate plan is. And it's not a secret, and it's not an assumption that the off-farm kids can be like, well, you had undue influence on dad because you're here every day, and some of those types of things that come around through the whole transition process. So the final component of how assets are distributed is through that probate process, and this would be a proceeding before a judge. A lot of time probate gets that negative connotation of being really a bad thing. However, having somebody say, here's the final decision of all the components for Heather Gessner at her death, that'd be really kind of handy to have. That so somebody else, 6, 8, 10 years after I'm gone can't come to my heirs and say, hey, I have an outstanding bill that I need you to pay. Well, that's too late after that point. Once the judge makes the decision, it's over and you can't bring any of those things back into mind. So, um, while it sometimes has a bad taste in people's mouth that came from some older, policies and procedures that, in the way that attorneys got paid going through the probate process, and it was a percentage of the assets. So the probate process became a really expensive process to work through. There's been some changes, especially in South Dakota law, relating to how people or how attorneys charge for probate and those types of things, and different estate planning attorneys and how they charge for probate proceedings and those types of things. So maybe it's not as nasty of a process that it really got, some of those bad feelings for in the past. One thing I want you to think about probate is that it occurs in two different instances, whether you die with a will or if you die without a will. So pretty much you're going to utilize the probate process to wrap up the estate process one way or the other. The catch is if you have your will written out, the process and the distribution of your assets and your personal property and all of those things that aren't already covered through a contract or through an ownership title are distributed the way you want them to be. You have a direct say that says, I want the grandfather clock that's in the living room, that goes to my nephew Joe. And the china dishes that are in the china closet, I want that whole thing to go to my daughter Betty. Okay. Those specific items and special bequests that maybe you have, if you don't have that written down in a will, they're not necessarily going to go to the individuals that you want them to go to, because it's not direct directions. And there's all kinds of different ways. I've seen, or I've had people tell me, I put post-it notes on the back of everything that I wanted in mom and dad's house, and that's how my grandma distributed stuff. She wrote on a piece of tape on the back side who gave it to her, with the assumption and understanding that it's supposed to go back to those kids. The catch is that sometimes post-it notes and tape, sometimes it falls off, you know, all really sweet and innocent, and sometimes they're removed, not necessarily sweet and innocent, because maybe more than one person wants that item. And that's where we get into some of those disputes. And sometimes those personal property disputes are way bigger than the ones covering big assets, because those are the ones that have, the memories tied to them and some of those types of things. So we really want to be thinking about what you have in your house, and what story goes with an item. Maybe it's the shotgun your grandpa taught you how to shoot ducks with. Would you like that when he's gone? If you do, you have those conversations and it's in the will and those types of things, and we pass it on, hopefully with no problems or very limited problems. Well, my computer seems locked up. So when we think about that with a will or without a will, South Dakota has a codified law that has a plan in place if you die without a will. It talks about where the money is going to go and the distribution of that cash to the heirs. Whereas we talked about with a will, that distribution goes by your wishes and how you want things to be passed on. So, what are you going to do now, right? Where are you going to go? What are we going to make happen? Here's some ideas. Here's some steps for you to be thinking about so that you can be proactive with your current estate plan. If you haven't put anything together, here's some challenges that I want you to do. Go find all your insurance policies, your retirement accounts, anything that has a beneficiary. And if they're kind of sprawled out through a whole bunch of different file folders, maybe we put all those in one spot. We designate a drawer to all these contracts. Make sure they're right, make any changes that need to happen there. Same thing with ownership. Find all of those titles. Where's the one for the 1947 silage truck? How is that titled? Where's the title at? Having those rounded up and found, not only helps with the transition at your death, it really helps make sure that your business entity is set up the way that you want it. So make sure things are listed right, make any changes that are needed that way. And then when we think about probate and that final component, after you're gone, if, go find your will and look at it. If you wrote it 40, 50 years ago and you have children that are 40 to 50 years old, probably there's some changes that you need to make to that will. Your children maybe now have children, and maybe some of them children have children, depending on how old you are. So you've got multiple generations that might be involved in, where you want assets to go. So update, or maybe that one just gets trashed and you start over. If you don't have a will, maybe we really need to be thinking about creating one so that we can ensure that all of the things go to the people that we want them to. Make a list of your personal property of things that you want to be distributed to certain individuals. Whether it's the grandfather clock or it's a painting on the wall, or I don't know, it could be a deer head or a gun, or a refurbished pickup that you and your son worked on together. Where do those things go so that we make sure that we have a list of that? And then, schedule an appointment with an estate planning attorney to set up one of those, set up a will, and maybe move beyond just a will into a real formal estate plan and succession plan for your operation. Some of the things that we really want you to do is make sure that you're taking that inventory and evaluate where you're at, put that plan idea together, create it, and implement it. You got to keep moving forward with these things. Um, Life is busy on the farm. There's always something to do. It's always a season for something. We've got to make an estate plan season somewhere in our planning process as well. I haven't figured out whether it fits in between silage cutting season and planting season, or baling season and spraying season and combining season, but somewhere we need an estate planning season so that we can get this thing put together and written up for our farm families. So kind of your homework assignments is to have those conversations, start working with your team and really starting to put together that list of items there before you go seeing an attorney so that you've got an idea of what you have, where you're at financially, where you're at within your family, and what do you want to have happen. And the more you can tell your attorneys, the better the plan, the better the situation will be, and the better that, whatever you're putting together doesn't contradict with maybe your best tax planning advice and those types of things. So having a good understanding of what you have and where you're at is really an important component. This one's just kind of a shameless plug. I do have some estate planning conferences coming up for this winter. I got these scheduled and written down. So we're going to be in Rapid City in November, Pier in December, Watertown in January, Aberdeen in February, and Mitchell in March. So registration will open for those in a little while. There'll be advertisements and those types of things, but keep that in mind if you need to do something more for your farm and for your family. Join us for those 3 days, and we'll try to help you out there a little bit as we go forward. So, lastly, what I'd like you to do. Go to this survey, take this survey, let us know what you thought about today's Ag Economic Dialogue session, and, and we'll kind of go from there.